Good afternoon. My name's Kyle Hart. I'm a solutions architect at Amazon Web Services going on just about 2 years, supporting our federal civilian customers. And later on in our presentation today, I'll be joined by Clive also from Amazon, and Mr. Webb from the United States Census Bureau to give his perspective on this topic, which is management at scale. So some of the key takeaways from this session, some of the ideas, some of the concepts that we want to convey, what we hope you get out of this is some insight, some vision, perhaps just some initial knowledge of some capabilities to help you increase your deployment and velocity of moving to the cloud. Now, why is this important? The cloud has tremendous potential. It has significant capability to offer customers, to offer organizations as they make that transformational journey. And we want to help you accelerate that to perhaps increase your impact in your organization or just increase the value and benefit you can gain from using cloud capabilities. We're also going to talk about some tools, some systems, some capabilities to help you maintain your security and compliance posture. I think it's implicit in terms of why this capability or why this takeaway is important. We want customers to run secure in the cloud, and we provide some tools to help with that, and we want to just help you understand what those tools are. And then lastly, we'll talk about some strategies for greater operational visibility and cost control of your cloud assets and things running in the cloud. It is a session on tools. There are a number of management tools in Amazon Web Services. The AWS ecosystem is very extensive and very broad. We have a number of third-party partners that have additional management tools that either extend the native AWS management capabilities, that leverage the AWS API for additional functionality. What we're going to talk about here is core and what's in that AWS provided native toolbox in terms of our management stack. You know, tools are important in any trade, whether you're doing construction or carpentry, automotive work or medical work, or certainly IT. Having the right tool for the right task is an important concept and an important capability and knowledge area to master. So what are the management tools in AWS and where do you find them? We have 10 listed in the AWS Management Console. And these management tools are specifically grouped under that management tool category. We have other tools in the security area and a number of other different product domain areas that also have significant management potential. We're going to focus on a subset of some of the tools listed here. Not all of them. There's more capability than we have time to address today, but we're going to talk about a subset of these tools and capabilities that can hopefully help you run your AWS environment more effectively when you go back to your organization that you're from. So let's talk about increasing deployment velocity. And the key theme for increasing deployment velocity with the cloud is leveraging some of the stack to improve your management, improve your automation, and standardization. So what can you automate in the cloud? What can you automate with AWS? There's kind of different areas of automation. The first topic here is rule or event-based deployment and remediation. So things like auto-scaling, that's a classic performance metric-driven automation capability where based upon utilization of a deployed resource, say you have a web server in your environment, that web server comes under a certain load, and based upon thresholds and parameters you define, you need to increase capacity for that web server. You can have an auto-scaling rule that adds additional web server capacity to that fleet. That's a classic auto-scaling use case I think most people are familiar with. Some of my federal government customers in the science space, in the science part of the federal government, have tremendous data sets, very large data sets that come in on a periodic basis and have to be processed very, very fast. Ways you can leverage event-driven or rule-based automation and rule-based deployment around that is when that data comes in, it may land in an S3 bucket. Their code may send a message to an SNS topic or write a message to an SQS, a simple queue service queue. Whatever the threshold or whatever the trigger is, you can then deploy your infrastructure in an automated fashion to go, and in this case, go and process that ingest data, generate their reduced product, and persist their post-process data. Examples of infrastructure deployed on demand in kind of an auto-scaling fashion, but auto-scaling is certainly not just for websites. You can deploy entire infrastructure based on these sorts of event-based deployment models. You can also do event-based remediation, and we'll talk about that later on, where when certain events of configuration changes in your environment occur, how can you address those in a programmatic fashion through automation and standardization. Of course, one of the other benefits, and hopefully some of you are familiar with this capability, is the ability to cut through a standard template fashion, deploy an entire infrastructure. And on top of that, the ability to both deploy your operating system environments, if you're deploying EC2 compute instances, and then automate some of the configuration settings within that operating system through a highly automated, highly scalable, standardized deployment capability. We call it CloudFormation, and I'll show some examples of that here in just a second. But at the end of the day, to run at scale in the cloud, automation is a critical subject area to master, and an incredible concept to deploy when you're running in the cloud is automation. So who has worked in environments, or maybe still works in environments that look something like this? That used to be my basement a few years ago, not anymore. I've since downsized and consolidated as more of my compute has moved to the cloud, and hopefully some of yours has moved to the cloud. But not too long ago, not too many years ago, some data centers may have looked something like this in terms of just as additional compute capability came online, it was added to the environment, and the environment grew around it. With the cloud, we can take our data center and represent the compute and infrastructure assets of our environment in a software-defined, and in this case, software model mechanism. This is an example of the CloudFormation Designer, where for this specific workload or this specific environment, we're not necessarily constrained by like the physical boundaries of a data center anymore. So I can model individual workloads or model entire environments, in this case, a virtual private cloud with a number of components. I can define through code the relationships of these components. I can define my EC2 security groups or my firewall rules, et cetera. I can define those parameters and deploy in an automated fashion my entire environment through CloudFormation. This is represented in this particular case this is JSON code. You can also represent and describe your CloudFormation environment in YAML code if that's a preferred markup language within your organization or what you prefer. The tool can switch back and forth fairly easily. We have a number of reference examples. We call them quick starts. We have quick starts relevant for a number of verticals within public sector, a number of technological focused quick starts. We have a quick start if you're in the federal space, either a federal government user or an industry supporting the federal government. We have a NIST 800-53 quick start to help build a representative environment with a number of those NIST controls implemented and documented to help customers stand up and get exposed to CloudFormation as well as get exposed to that NIST compliant environment. That's deployed and driven through this CloudFormation technology as an example. But the idea here is that customers can build their own self-documenting immutable infrastructures, define those through code in that software-defined infrastructure. So to take CloudFormation to the next step for different workloads and deploy additional capability in your environment, we have another AWS management tool called AWS Service Catalog. So I'm going to bring Clive D'Souza on stage to talk us through Service Catalog.
Thank you, Kyle. So, Kyle mentioned about accelerating the journey to the cloud. One of the things which we see very often with large-scale deployments is a need for governance. And think of it, right? I mean, you have a CloudFormation script, and you have multiple workloads or multiple different BUs going to the cloud at the same time. It's no longer a matter of just, 5, 10, 15, 20 CloudFormation scripts. It pretty rapidly becomes tens of thousands of instances being deployed at large scale. So this problem started coming up, and we started seeing a need for governance. And there were two personas which bubbled up. On one end, it was the end user, who was the consumer of these services, right? And they cared more about agility. And in the colloquial manner, they want to go from the keyboard very quickly straight to deployment in minutes, as opposed to waiting for a complete LAMP stack being deployed for them. On the other hand, you have the Cloud Center of Excellence, or your architects, or your security, or CISOs and CTOs, who care a lot about security, who care a lot about actual policy enforcement, and especially if there are workloads which need to adhere to certain standards, only one specific version or one specific rev of that is allowed inside an organization. So what Service Catalog does essentially is it's a management tool, allows you to balance the needs of both of them, right? And the way we do that, if you look at it, is it is built on CloudFormation, but there are key attributes to this which I want to call out. If you look at how today you deploy a workload into the cloud today, what matters is, especially for large-scale sprawls, people say, hey, how do I tag particular assets? If it's cost center, XYZ project, ABC, and if it's a user group mapping to a specific thing, how do I enable that? So there are certain features within Service Catalog that enables you to do that. We have something called a tag option library. These are free flow or free form key value pairs, where a Cloud Center of Excellence can mandate right from the get-go what kind of tagging you enable, right? The other thing which we have seen Cloud Center of Excellence always demand when they're going for scale, and Kyle kind of briefly brought about it is, and the analogy I like to give is, we had a exec from a very large multinational company, and he said that, hey, I had a $4 million weekend. And when we asked him, what do you mean by that? He said, hey, we forgot to shut down a bunch of instances, and guess what? Come Monday morning, we had a $4 million outage, right? So, and I'm sure quite a few of you have, can relate to that. So the way we enabled those kind of governance controls in Service Catalog is something through the use of constraints. And there are two kinds of constraints. One is a dollar-based constraint. So think of it as, hey, if you have a DevOps team and they should be allowed only X number of hours of EC2 for a specific project, you can put that constraint in there and say, hey, after $50,000, kick off a workflow, it needs to get approved, or shut it down, or whatever custom action you want to do. The other one which we implemented is a threshold-based constraint. And this is where it comes in when Kyle mentioned if you have a SaaS offering, or if you have a BYO inside your company, and you have only 50, 60, or 70 number of licenses, and you want to tag it and say, like, hey, I can't go past that. So you can use Service Catalog to put a cap on that, right? And then depending upon what actions you define, once the cap is reached, you can manage your workloads. Either go and get approval for more, or shut down certain, or just stop further implementations, right? So that is one of the governance we see being enabled. The other concept we are seeing a lot is the concept of portfolios. So here is where Service Catalog does things a little bit differently. Think of portfolio as an application portfolio stack. So this is essentially, you'll have your homegrown application, right? You'll have an analytics stack, it'll have its own database, it'll have its own specific version of operating system, and then eventually you'll have your third-party or homegrown analytics engine behind it, right? So what Service Catalog enables you is it lets you stack up the entire stack, and you wrap that around a CloudFormation, and that becomes a product. And the beauty of that is when you're doing large-scale governance and want to deploy a set number of versions or a set number of products, you can control this in a centralized hub. So a governance essentially is enabled at a central IT offering or a central IT office. So if you're a SOC 2 compliant, or you have ITAR requirements, or you have FINRA requirements, you can control that in one specific location, or if you will, in the layer of the stack, and the entire organization, from a deployment perspective, then becomes compliant based on that policy. So you can do that as a one-stop shop. And all of this, if you look at the white line I have on the screen right now, is essentially abstracted from the user. All these constraints, all these tags, all these provisioning policies essentially are abstracted, and all the users see when they log in, if you will, is this console. And we kind of embellished it, and essentially what Service Catalog allows you to do is you can have your own white labeling. So we took a picture of one of the guys who works for me, his puppy, and then you can put whatever color palette you want for your organization. And the nuances here is if a specific user logs in, based on the user access and the user type, they will get to see only those offerings or those software, if you will, for which they are approved for. So they remove the guessing game away, right? They're not logging into an AWS Marketplace console and you have all of a sudden access to 3,000 or 5,000 offerings, and next thing you know, you have a wild, wild west. So this is another way organizations actually come in and then they govern, right? You will have access to only what you approve for, at what point in time. If it's project-based, you can set those constraints. If it's team-based, you can set those constraints right here. So these are some of the ways we are enabling governance at scale. Now, there are a whole bunch of use cases which are bubbled up. I'm not going to bring all of them up. But the key one which I want to talk about is integration with ITSM. And the reason this is important is what we are seeing is in large organizations, there is a propensity to use something like a ServiceNow or a BMC Digital Workspaces as a front end to vend even the cloud native assets. So what we did, taking the feedback from the customers, is we now have Service Catalog natively integrated into both Service Now as well as BMC. So what it offsets for the end consumer is they can then use the existing workflows which they have in ServiceNow, and when they log in, depending upon, again, it kind of maps onto what the user access needs to be, depending upon their role, they get to see what has been provisioned for them by the central IT. So it gives them that one-stop shop, if you will, again, using the same look and feel. The other thing which we have seen from a governance and compliance use case, proactively we've seen organizations start defining, I want to have a specific version of Ubuntu with a specific rev of Splunk or Teradata or what have you, right? And within that software gold image, I want to shut down certain ports. I want to lock down port 8080, or I want to have a specific driver implemented for some of my checks based on some policies I'm running. So this is fast becoming a use case where essentially Service Catalog ends up getting an entire portfolio as an application, and that becomes hardened over a period of time. And the usage of that, again, kind of goes down to scaling. It's a hub and spoke model. So every time the CISO has a mandated new requirement for a new OS image, or you want to flip a bit on a specific aspect of your software within the veneer, you can do that. And we are seeing more and more heavily regulated industries, be it public sector, aviation, financials, going down that path and saying, hey, I'm going to have a stack which will be centralized. We can version control it, we can rev it, and we can even go and put constraints and tags on it, depending upon which organization or which group can use it, even for what products and projects. So in a very high level, these are some of the use cases we are seeing Service Catalog implement. So with that, Kyle, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Clive. So we've discussed how to increase velocity via standardization and automation, the two main capabilities, the two main management tools in AWS to think of when it comes to that is CloudFormation and AWS Service Catalog. Next up, we're going to talk about how you can help use this management stack to better maintain security and compliance. And we have some tools that help with this, primarily through, in the management area, we also have a number of security tools, but primarily through configuration management. So what is involved with maintaining security and compliance? Continuous monitoring, knowing what assets you have deployed, the state of those assets, both from a performance and availability perspective of those assets, but also from a continuous assessment perspective, do those assets comply with current security baseline requirements? Have your baseline requirements change? And do your assets comply with future standards or the currently changed standards of your baseline compliance? From a change management perspective, we have a capability within AWS to help with change management, to help catalog changes. And this capability is known as AWS Config. So I've had customers ask, does AWS have a CMDB? How can AWS help with change management my environment? Or from a retrospective view of things, we had a change of our instance or of a configuration setting or a parameter. What was the state of this particular asset in the past? And AWS Config is that management tool that can help address some of these issues and answer some of these questions. So here's a view of an AWS Config Dashboard. And in that main column on the left, it shows the various types of AWS assets that Config has management, visibility, and knowledge into. And then over on the right side of this dashboard view, it's showing a configuration rule compliance chart. Based upon configuration rules that I've defined, it's showing my the current quantity of deployed assets that are deviating from those rules in specific areas. In this example, for those that may not be able to read these slides in the back, I've got some rules defined to check S3 buckets that they only allow inbound SSL requests. And there could be a very good reason why a bucket would not want an inbound to require inbound SSL. But in this case, I have a rule that checks for that, and I have 14 that do not comply with this particular rule. It's surfaced up on this dashboard view. I can go in and triage and look at those particular buckets to see if they truly should be configured that way or if that's a setting that I should turn on. You can define additional rules. We have a number of rules in the box, and we'll talk about rules here in just a little bit, but you can also define your own rules. Other examples, of config rules that some of my customers have deployed and use in their environments, making sure that nobody installs an internet gateway in a VPC. And you can certainly enforce that through quality permissions management, but they can also have rules that when they detect the presence of an internet gateway in a VPC, to go in and disattach and remove that internet gateway. Other config rules can check for unrestricted SSH access. If somebody opens up a security group to allow inbound SSH access to an EC2 host from the entire world, right, 0.0.0.0, or from a disallowed range of IP addresses, you can configure a rule to check for that, bubble that up, and show it right here on your configuration dashboard with AWS Config. From an overall configuration management capability with AWS Config, we also have this configuration timeline. So when you enable configuration timeline, it tracks and records the state change of assets that it's able to monitor. And for an EC2 instance, start and stop are considered states. So it will record those as events as well. On a timeline view, I can go in and view the details of what particular change or state change triggered config to record that information, and I can get very nice and lovely human-readable views of that particular state change to include what it was before and what it was changed to. So if a security group changes, if a disk association changes, any number of track changes occur, I can see what it was previously and what it is going forward. You can enable AWS Config. This gets logged and retained, and you can have that snapshot view. Even on deleted assets, you can enable a view for viewing AWS Config history and that configuration trail of deleted assets as well. And this is also available in machine-readable JSON format if you want to build systems or integrate this with other systems that can ingest this data. That information is also available. So one of the more powerful capabilities of AWS Config is AWS Config rules. And so I talked a little bit about rules on that dashboard view and when I was showing the compliance status of those rules. But in this particular case, the processing pipeline is such that when an event change occurs, a change to a configuration asset or configuration of an asset occurs, AWS Config is notified of that change and processes it through a rules pipeline. And these rules can do any number of things that you define in that particular rule. It can send out a notification through the simple notification service, which can text somebody. It can post a request to a logging system. It can email somebody an email alert when a particular rule has changed. But you can also, by API access, have Lambda functions trigger when a particular rule occurs. So behind the scenes, AWS ships, in this particular, when I took this screenshot a few weeks ago, we had 51 rules available total and 18 rules. If I just filtered in the search view on EC2, you can see some rules that we define, but you can also create your custom rules backed by a Lambda function so that when a specific configuration event occurs, your rule logic can process and do any sort of automated remediation action that you feel is appropriate for that particular change that you've detected in your environment. So that's a quick view of the CMDB capabilities, or that change management database capability with AWS Config, as well as the ability to maintain ongoing compliance through rule processing. Additionally, how you can maintain compliance for systems at scale. How do you maintain compliance for systems at scale? Well, we have something called AWS Systems Manager. This launched back in reInvent this past November, where we integrated some existing management capability and brought it under AWS Systems Manager, but also extended AWS Systems Manager to help address the following questions and give customers a comprehensive view on a workload by workload basis of their workload and of their applications. So some of the problems or some of the questions that we're trying to solve and address with AWS Systems Manager is a view of the resources and components that make up your application, the current health status of those components, to include management down at the OS level of EC2 instances, and the ability to push out and run execution scripts or execution commands on multiple machines with a single administrative mouse click. So the ability to run configuration commands and scripts at scale across a fleet of machines. So we pulled in this concept with AWS Systems Manager. It's a dynamic query capability. So based upon specific tags on a variety of instances or asset types, I can come back with a single view, a single health view of those deployed assets that make up that particular workload. So in this case, I've got a tag called project. That's the name of the tag, and it's project A. It's pretty specific. And I have a variety of VPC, of instances that come back, security groups, S3 buckets, RDS databases, a number of different AWS components that share that same project tag because they're part of that same workload, even though they're different systems on AWS, are returned and displayed here in my screen for a view of my entire workload and get a workload-wide view of what I have deployed. So I can then gain insights of those particular assets and see their compliance by rule, et cetera. And we'll talk about some of these additional management capabilities that we have with AWS Systems Manager. The run command. Has anybody ever used the run command with Systems Manager or EC2 Systems Manager? Fairly powerful capability. Inventory, patch management. I've got some examples I'll show of a number of these that I think could be useful, hopefully useful takeaways, just in terms of new ways, new ideas to run things in the cloud efficiently. So the run command, we ship with a number, we call them documents, but a number of these run documents, and you can filter based on Windows, based on Linux. These are basically predefined commands. And one of these run documents is just run custom shell script. So if we don't have a run document for you, you can create your own document, or you can just paste in your shell script in the case of Linux, or PowerShell in the case of Windows, and push this command out. The Systems Manager does require an agent that we ship in the box for AWS AMIs, or that you can install if you're running a non-AWS AMI. It's a pretty straightforward installation path for that agent. Once that agent's installed, once that machine has the appropriate role attached to it, you can then administer it and manage it through the AWS console and manage that at scale. That same agent provides patch capabilities, inventory capabilities, a number of different things. So some customers, as they're doing their migration from on-premises to the cloud, may have significant investments in systems management software from a variety of vendors and a variety of stacks that were probably appropriate when they were running large data centers on premises. And they can certainly run and deploy and duplicate that infrastructure and run some of those same things in the cloud. But we wanted to make everybody aware of the capability we have in box that is not at an additional charge with this run command, with Systems Manager, the ability to both remotely administer and maintain machines. And these are machines you don't even have to log into, right? So when you deploy a Linux host on AWS, when you deploy Windows, our default deployment process is you can deploy it with credentials, so you can log into that machine. You do not even need credentials with the run command. You could have a machine configured with no local credentials, but still administer it through the run command and through Systems Manager, to include pulling back inventory data, as I show in this particular case, for Windows, for Linux, a variety of deployed software. If you have to comply with software compliance from different vendors, you can use this to pull your software inventory in a scalable and kind of cloud-native, cloud-friendly fashion. If you want to view patch status of your machines, we ship some patch baselines that we define. You can create and enforce your own patch baselines based upon just different patch categories for the different vendors, low, medium, in this case, critical, high, informational type alerts. Define your patch baseline, define when you want to deploy this patch baseline, and use AWS Systems Manager to manage both the patch reporting as well as the actual patching of deployed instances that you have in the cloud. So just another way to help you manage deployed EC2 instances in a cloud-native, cloud-friendly fashion at a fairly low cost compared to what you might have in your enterprise from other systems. So here's an example patch report from a specific machine. You can see there it has 45 updates already installed, 23 updates needed. It's kind of patch reporting. But in the view, you can do this at scale across your entire fleet of EC2 instances, or filter based upon tag for specific workloads, et cetera, whatever the case may be as you're administering and maintaining your environment. So we've talked about managing your configuration of AWS kind of platform capabilities as well as EC2 assets. And the primary management tools for that are AWS Systems Manager and, of course, AWS Config. Let's talk next about ways you can gain greater operational visibility and cost control. And this is going to be using the monitoring capabilities that we have in AWS and additional tools and capabilities that extract information from this monitoring platform to help customers run things in the cloud more efficiently. So here's a classic screenshot from CloudWatch. In this particular case, I'm tracking on an EC2 instance my CPU utilization and my network utilization. But CloudWatch is a monitoring platform that tracks metrics across a variety of AWS types. On an instance level, if we're talking about EC2 instances, or on S3 buckets. It's a very powerful tool to get familiar with and get to know. It's not just about tracking CPU usage on particular hosts, although that is important. One of the things I find with customers as they're making that migration from on-premises to the cloud is what do they provision when they go to the cloud, right? That's the question. And they'll have their on-premises footprint of, for a particular workload, how much RAM, how much CPU, is assigned to a specific machine. And so that they'll probably start out with modeling their cloud deployment based upon their same footprint that they have that deployed infrastructure on premises with. That just bumped my cable, that's not good. So there we go. So when customers do that, they oftentimes, some customers do, but oftentimes customers don't have a complete view of their utilization of those deployed assets on premises. And so when they run to the cloud, they can turn on CloudWatch and see, are they over-provisioned or are they under-provisioned? Oftentimes, frankly, customers are over-provisioned when they're migrating to the cloud. They can get away with running slightly smaller instances based upon actual resource demand on those machines. And CloudWatch is one mechanism where you can return and get that data. I had another example where CloudWatch, I think, is interesting and useful. A customer was asking why their bill was getting as high as it was and why it was growing unexpectedly. And we drilled in, and I'll show some of the cost monitoring tools here in a little bit, but we actually jumped into CloudWatch when we saw in the cost tool that their S3 usage was increasing month over month by a modest amount compared to their total bill, but still worth looking at. We jumped into CloudWatch, and it was a bucket, specifically a bucket that their backup system was backing up to, and their backup system was, say it was 10 terabytes weekly, it was set to override existing backups. So they expected a flat line of 10 terabytes in that S3 bucket. Well, we had a nice vertical slope of the growth of that bucket. And so we drilled into the S3 bucket, and they had versioning turned on that bucket, which would cause, when files get overwritten, cause still copies of those files to be retained. So that's an example of how we use CloudWatch to both see and get diagnostics of what was happening in their environment and translate it back to cost savings on their build, in that particular case, due to a configuration situation. CloudWatch Logs is another fairly useful capability. So CloudWatch Logs, there's a couple of different logging mechanisms, but in this case, I've configured a machine. You can kind of see down there towards the bottom, I've configured a machine, an EC2 host. It could also be an on-premises host, Windows or Linux. I've configured that machine to send its var log secure and var log messages files into CloudWatch. So it's a log aggregation capability of deployed machines. My costs involved in this, there's some slight ingestion costs and then just the ongoing storage costs, fairly insignificant, fairly small. But I can now pull that log data aggregate from across a number of machines into CloudWatch and graph and draw useful inferences as if it's on a metric basis. So in this case, my var log secure, I built a CloudWatch graph view that showed the count of invalid users. So basically, this is a host that has a SSH security group opened up to the world, and I'm tracking how many invalid user attempts are made to log on to this EC2 host. But I can pull that dimension data into CloudWatch, build alerts on that, and have it send out email alerts. I can do any number of other things with this type of data that comes in. And one of the things I can do is ship this data off from CloudWatch Logs through a pipeline that basically ends up in an ELK stack, Elasticsearch and Kibana, for more detailed analysis. We have an example that shows this particular solution where it's taking my VPC flow logs, another logging capability we have in AWS that monitors source and destination IP traffic, the ports that, the source ports, source IP address, destination, et cetera, packet size, date. And you can take that VPC flow log information, pump it through a pipeline, through CloudWatch, in this case through a Kinesis data stream that then sends it and deposits it on an Elasticsearch instance. So in this case, there's a host on the internet with RDP open. You can see port 3389, and the flow logs are just showing different connection attempts. There's a Lambda function as part of that processing pipeline that takes the source IP address and resolves it to the country of origin. It does a geo lookup and then pushes that as well into Elasticsearch. So you can kind of see reporting here and see where different login attempts for RDP to my particular host on the internet are coming from, and you can see our top countries that are trying to access my machine at that particular time of day that we're accessing in Germany, Canada, et cetera. You can just kind of resolve geographically. An example of taking log data through a processing pipeline and then visualizing it in additional visualization systems to extract additional knowledge. And that solution, that solution's online to enrich that log data with VPC flow logs to Elasticsearch. So we've talked about monitoring and monitoring your infrastructure and your EC2 assets with CloudWatch. Let's now talk about cost management at scale. So cost management, one of the key things for effective cost management is good cost allocation tags. And tagging in general, if you take nothing else away from this session, understand the importance of tagging your data or tagging your AWS assets. Those tags flow through from management, from permissions, and certainly from cost monitoring capabilities. They flow throughout the entire AWS ecosystem. So it's important to have a good tagging strategy of your assets in your environment. We also have a capability called Cost Explorer, which I'll show here in just a moment, and then Trusted Advisor. Frankly, that's another thing. I write down tagging, but also write down Trusted Advisor. If you've not run Trusted Advisor before, definitely go poke around some of the Trusted Advisor reports. It's going to give you great insight into both the performance as well as the cost and security of your AWS assets. So here's a view of Cost Explorer. It shows spend by service over a period of time, and I can kind of see just different trends, different views of what my usage of AWS is. I can swap that over to a graphical view, and I can say, okay, well, I've got a nice little spike there of the RDS, the relational database service, between January and February. What's going on? Was I doing an experiment? If I want to dig into that additional, in this case, that additional $150 spend, in large enterprises, these numbers, of course, the y-axis would calibrate a little differently, but you can kind of get a good view of your usage and consumption of AWS assets over time. So here's a snapshot of Trusted Advisor. Cost optimization, performance, security, fault tolerance, service limits. Please go take a look at Trusted Advisor. You want to definitely get a view and get familiar with the reporting capability of Trusted Advisor and the views that it gives you into your environment. So that was a quick fly-through of cost management at scale. Next up, we have Mr. Brock Webb from the United States Census Bureau to give us his perspective on, next up after this slide, to give us his perspective on running management at scale on AWS. But the key takeaways, the key things to remember with AWS, automate and standardize your deployments. You can use management tools and capabilities to view and enforce security and compliance and gain better operational visibility and cost control in order to help you more effectively manage your cloud assets at scale. So with no further ado, Mr. Webb to give us his perspective on managing the cloud at scale.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I think you guys have seen quite a few slides, lots of capabilities. I'm not going to have any slides. I'm just going to have a conversation about management at scale, some of the experiences that we've had. It really leads me to conclude that there are really three things that you really need to manage at scale. The right kind of culture, the right tools for your situation, and the right kind of leadership. Now let's talk about culture, because I think that is the most important thing of anything that you really need to develop. Culture is 90% of your problem. As you see, most of the solutions already exist, and there's plenty of solutions out there. That's 10% of the problem. Yet it seems that most of the time what we do is focus on 10% of the problem. Why? Because we can understand it. Culture's hard, it's difficult. It doesn't always make a lot of sense. But that is indeed where you need to focus on things. I'll paraphrase Thoreau, who said, "There are thousands hacking at the branches for the one hacking at the root." Same kind of thing is that if you're not attacking the culture problem, you're just whacking the branches. You're not striking the root. Now, I think a lot about culture, really think a lot about culture and how to change. I've been a change agent for many years. And I even try to do these things at home and my test bed for culture. That's called my kids. I know you've had kids, and I have this problem that I've been trying to solve. And I know a lot of people, when they're new to the cloud, they won't turn their darn instance off. They just leave it running. Well, my kids, they will never turn the light off when they leave the room. I don't know if anyone else has this problem. I even find myself repeating phrases that my parents like, "Close the door. You want to heat the neighborhood?" Yeah, I'm like cringing when I do it. But I do it. It doesn't seem to work. I think I would have lost my voice by now because I've already stopped trying to remind them. I've tried other things. I've tried the emotional appeal, where I've gone and said, you know, and a good parenting technique is to get down at their level. It's like, when you do that, it makes Mother Earth cry. Well, don't worry, it's been repeated back to me, so I'm like, another thing I have to watch what I say because it will come back. Didn't work. So I thought, well, let's kind of take a cloud approach. You know, you tag things like the refrigerator door. It's probably 5 cents when they stare at it. You know, when they leave the door open, you know, maybe that's 10 cents. Or, you know, the 25-cent handful of shampoo that they apparently need. You know, I try to tell them about all these things, and they just don't listen. And you saw that there's plenty of stuff to do this in the cloud, and certainly tagging is an incredibly important tool. But I stumbled on something that actually finally worked, but not on the lights. It works on shampoo, and it actually extends itself to other things. I mean, I think my kids are pretty smart. They already kind of get the cloud. They already know how to get things on Netflix and Amazon Prime. And, you know, their solution to most things is a cloud concept. Well, if you break it, well, let's just get a new one. I'm like, that works with virtual machines, not your toys. But, you know, I think they get it, and so just thinking about the fact that they understand these concepts, I figured, well, I'll try this, you know, approach when they happen to squeeze half of a bottle of shampoo into the bathtub because they're going to have a bubble bath. And I don't want to crack down on the kids and, you know, get them too upset. You get a freebie, right? You know, they're learning. You know, we have to have a chance to fail. And they failed. I didn't want to fail as a parent, so I just said simply, guys, I understand you want a bubble bath. That's great. I'd be happy to help you with that. But if you squeeze out or waste the shampoo like that again, you're going to have to pay for it. Well, it turned out not more than a week later, they filled up the bottle, the half bottle remaining of shampoo that they hadn't already squeezed out in their big handfuls, and we're having, you know, it suddenly got really silent. And then I heard a lot of noise. I'm like, okay, I have to investigate because I know something's going on. My kids in trouble are like sugar to ants. So they're in there playing water blaster with this bottle of shampoo and just like blasting each other and squirting bubbles all over the place. And it was all fun and games till I said, boys, I've talked to you about this. This is coming out of your banks. And that's when their faces fell. They were devastated by this. And they started crying in tears as I got both of their banks and counted out $2.50 out of each one of them. And now this bank represents, of course, their dinosaur toys, robots, Pokemon cards, Legos, the things that they want. I'm taking their hopes and dreams and I'm crushing it. But now, before you think I'm completely terrible, I secretly put all the money back. I think they learned the lesson. In fact, they learned the lesson so well that I have not had any shampoo incidents in about a year. And now my oldest thinks, well, I'm like, Warren, I don't want you to make 10 copies, color copies of your crayon drawing. I love your drawing, but that's a lot of printer ink. Well, he'll go get his bank and he'll say, I'll pay for it. He's got consumption. But I still have to get a little bit on cost discipline. So I'm getting there, I'm improving. And that's part of Cultures also as a continuous learning organization. Let's talk about some of those tools. Tagging, absolutely critical. When we first started out, it was the Wild West. We allowed people to tag things or maybe not tag things. And if there was a word they tagged it with, then they would find 5 other alternative spelling variations to tag it with that. So you'd get test, T-E-T-S, T-S-T. You'd get all sorts of wacky behavior. So we were eventually were able to whack that out, and now we enforce tagging. As I would say, underlined with any tools, automation. Top 3 principles that we have for our engineering team is automate, automate, and automate. And that is one of their big focuses, and the automation builds on itself. You get this exponential return as you automate more and more. And so we automate into our security policy all the necessary tags, all the user stuff, all the encryption stuff, so that when something is deployed, it has all that stuff in there. And so we can track and know what everybody's using. Then comes the monitoring part, where we start looking at these cost dashboards. And we have cost dashboards, and we use those, and we, of course, get security alerts, and we monitor those kinds of things. And the cost dashboards are actually really great because we were able to look at a customer and say, hey, noticed you are spending about $8,000 on Elastic Block this month. Have you thought about simple storage service? You know, what's going on here? We tried to have a conversation. Because I think that's important is a culture of excellent customer service if you're a service provider, which we are, helping our customers get to cloud. And it turned out they were doing some things, and yes, S3 could have been appropriate. And you know, I think, but the whole idea is that I was trying to get them motivated to do it themselves, and they completely were. They were ready to change over to S3, they got things changed over, and they were saving money. You know, really the whole conversation was about, this is awesome capability, and if you use it like this, then you don't have more capability unless you find more money, which sometimes can be really difficult. Because you either don't get funded at the beginning of the year, you maybe can get some funding, you know, halfway through the year, and then if you're, you know, in the right position, you can get end of year funding. So certainly, you know, that is incredibly important. The last thing I would say, I have a minute left, but the last thing is the ability to launch and provision from a single pane of glass into our data center and to our cloud instance with the same thing. And we do have our own custom service catalog where we have different instances and images. So those are the tools that we mainly use right now. We are looking for some more automation in the forms of cost management. But really, I do want to quickly talk about leadership and the right kind of leadership. And the kind of leadership is the right kind of servant leaders that can allow your teams to fail, that enable your teams, and let them get out there and do things. Andy Jassy said that there's no compression algorithm for experience. That's so true. I mean, I'd say in the government, how many times do you sit there and have an endless discussion for 6 to 8 to 12 months and no one does a thing? And had they just gone out and failed and learned, they would have been far better off. And that's the kind of culture that we're trying to create, and it requires leadership to do that. It doesn't always make everybody happy, and to quote Steve Jobs, if you want to make people happy, sell ice cream, don't be a leader. I know I am all out of time for today, but I want to thank you for your time, and I'll stick around if there's any questions for me, and if anybody has any ideas for the kids with the lights, I'd be all ears for that. Thank you.